Most plans feel reasonable when we make them. That's the problem. You look at the task, you break it into steps, you think this should take a weekend. And in that moment, nothing feels reckless. But weeks later, the project is still unfinished, not because of a disaster, not because of a crisis, just quiet delay, a little slippage, then a little more, until the deadline passes without drama and without completion. This doesn't happen to careless people. It happens to smart, motivated people who genuinely intend to follow through. And that tells us something important. Most planning failures don't announce themselves. They don't arrive as spectacular collapses. They arrive as almost finished. A project that should have taken a weekend, a task that slipped a day, then a week, then a month. A deadline missed by someone who worked hard and cared deeply. And when this happens, the explanation usually turns inward. I should have tried harder. I mismanaged my time. I underestimated how busy I'd be. But notice what we're not saying. We're not talking about laziness. We're not talking about incompetence. We're not talking about lack of motivation. In fact, if intelligence and effort were enough, these errors would disappear with experience. They don't. Highly capable people repeat the same mistake again and again, even after being burned by it before. That's the first clue that something deeper is happening. This is not a failure of character. It's a failure of prediction. And to understand it, we need to separate two things that feel similar but aren't: planning and doing. To see why this mistake survives intelligence and experience, we need to look at a gap most people don't realize they're crossing: the gap between knowing and doing. There's a quiet distinction at the center of almost every planning failure. Knowing how long something should take is not the same as experiencing how long it actually takes. On paper, the task looks straightforward. You understand the steps. You've done similar things before. Nothing feels unfamiliar. But planning doesn't happen in the same environment as execution. Planning happens in calm conditions. You're rested, undistracted, looking at the task from the outside. Execution happens under friction. You're interrupted. You're juggling dependencies. You're tired in ways you didn't anticipate. Information arrives late or not at all. Small uncertainties compound into delays. This difference matters more than we intuitively realize. When we plan, we imagine a smooth path forward. When we work, we move through resistance. Emails arrive, tools fail, people respond slower than expected. Energy fluctuates. Unexpected decisions appear midstream. None of these feel dramatic on their own, but together they reshape the timeline. And here's the critical point. When you estimate time, you are usually estimating the ideal version of the task. The version where nothing goes wrong, nothing interrupts, nothing takes longer than expected. But that version exists only in theory. This is why experience doesn't automatically protect us. Even after doing similar work before, we tend to plan from memory of how it felt when things went right, not from the full distribution of how things actually went. The mind remembers intention more vividly than friction, which leads to a simple but easily ignored truth. Planning is done in theory. Work is done in reality. And the larger the gap between those two worlds, the more confident but wrong our estimates become. That gap has a name, and once you see it clearly, you start to notice it everywhere. Once you see the gap between theory and reality, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why doesn't experience close it? Psychologists have a name for this pattern. It's called the planning fallacy. In plain language, it means this: we systematically underestimate how long things will take, how much they will cost, and how complex they will become. And we do this even when we've done similar things before. That last part is what makes the planning fallacy so persistent. If this were just ignorance, experience would correct it. If it were just optimism, failure would temper it. But neither happens reliably. People who are intelligent, motivated, and experienced continue to make the same planning errors again and again. So what's going on? The answer lies in how the human mind plans. When we estimate time, we don't simulate outcomes. We simulate intentions. We imagine ourselves working smoothly. We picture effort, focus, and progress. We replay the version of the task where we do what we mean to do. What we don't naturally imagine are the deviations, the interruptions, the delays, the rework. the moments where energy drops or information changes. Those elements don't feel central to the task, so they get left out of the estimate. This is why experience alone doesn't solve the problem. Past failures don't automatically update future plans, because planning is not driven by memory of outcomes. It's driven by a story of intent. And that leads to a crucial insight. We plan for how things are supposed to go, not for how they usually go. The planning fallacy isn't a mistake in arithmetic, it's a mistake in imagination. We imagine the future from the inside, while reality unfolds from the outside. And until that mismatch is addressed, adding effort, motivation, or confidence only makes the commitment happen faster, not more accurately. Once people recognize this pattern, they usually try to correct for it. Just not enough. Most people are not completely unaware of this problem. They've missed deadlines before. They've underestimated projects before, so they try to adjust. They say things like, "I'll add a little extra time, just to be safe." And it feels responsible. But the correction is almost always too small. When researchers look at real-world projects across domains, software, construction, education, personal goals, a striking pattern appears. On average, actual completion time is not slightly longer than estimated. It's about 40% longer. In simple terms, actual time equals estimated time 1.4. This isn't a law of nature. It's an observed tendency, and it shows up even when people know they tend to underestimate. So why does undercorrection persist? Because the missing time doesn't come from things we consciously ignore. It comes from things we can't see yet. At the planning stage, unknowns are invisible. You don't yet know which steps will be harder. You don't know which dependencies will fail. You don't know where rework will be required. That information only appears after commitment. And once you've committed, once time, money, or reputation are already invested, the cost of revising the plan feels higher. There's another force at work as well. Early confidence suppresses the imagination of failure. When a plan first takes shape, it feels clean and coherent. The mind latches onto that coherence and protects it. So even when we add a buffer, we add it to an already optimistic baseline. The adjustment happens inside the same flawed frame, which leads to a subtle but important insight. The problem isn't optimism. It's that optimism survives the first correction. We don't fail to plan. We fail to plan for how plans break. And that's why being realistic so often means being slightly less wrong, but still wrong in the same direction. But there's a deeper reason this correction fails, and it has less to do with math than with emotion. Up to this point, we've talked about errors in estimation. But estimation alone doesn't explain why the planning fallacy feels so convincing. To understand that, we need to look at what planning does to the brain. This is the emotional engine of the fallacy. When you plan a task, when you outline it, organize it, or talk it through, the brain treats that activity as a form of completion. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik Effect. In simple terms, it means that the mind experiences a sense of closure when a task feels mentally resolved, even if nothing has been done yet. Here's what happens internally. Planning creates structure. Structure reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty triggers relief. The brain releases dopamine when a task feels contained and under control, not finished in reality, but finished in the mind. The result is an illusion. The body relaxes, the mind registers progress, motivation briefly increases. But the external world hasn't changed. No work has been completed, no obstacles have been removed, no time has actually been saved. Yet subjectively, it feels like something important has happened. This explains several familiar experiences, why planning feels productive even when it replaces action. Why talking about work can feel as satisfying as doing it. Why starting a task can feel dangerously close to finishing it. The mind confuses clarity with completion, and this is the line that matters most. Your brain rewards finishing the plan, not finishing the work. That reward arrives early, before friction appears, before uncertainty is encountered, which means the emotional payoff is front-loaded while the real effort is deferred. And once that payoff is felt, confidence increases precisely when caution should. If the brain rewards premature closure, the question becomes, is there a way to interrupt that reward before commitment hardens? One practical response to the planning fallacy comes from a simple shift in perspective. It's called the pre-mortem, introduced by Gary Klein. Most planning meetings ask a familiar question: how do we succeed? The pre-mortem asks something very different. Assume this project has already failed. It's months later and the outcome is bad. What went wrong? That single reframing changes the psychological terrain. Instead of defending a hopeful plan, people are invited to explain a failure that has already happened. This matters because it bypasses optimism bias. When people are asked to predict failure directly, they hesitate. They soften their doubts. They don't want to sound negative. But when failure is treated as a given, doubt becomes diagnostic rather than disloyal. The pre-mortem also does something quietly important. It makes skepticism socially acceptable. Concerns that would normally stay unspoken suddenly have permission to surface. Dependencies are questioned. Hidden assumptions are exposed. Single points of failure become visible. And crucially, this happens before full commitment, before budgets are locked, before timelines harden, before reputations are attached. That timing is the real value. The pre-mortem doesn't prevent problems. It reveals them while change is still cheap. But it's important to be precise about what this tool can and cannot do. The pre-mortem does not eliminate the planning fallacy. It only makes the blind spots visible. People still underestimate. They still feel early confidence. They still plan from intention. What changes is awareness. Instead of being surprised by failure modes later, they are named earlier. And that difference between surprise and foresight is often the difference between fragile plans and resilient ones. Once these blind spots are visible, a final question remains. If this is a real mechanism, we should see it repeat across very different domains. We do. These examples are not anecdotes. They are not unlucky cases. They are predictable manifestations of the same cognitive mechanism. Change the setting, change the scale. The structure of the error remains. A developer looks at a bug. It seems trivial, 5 minutes, maybe 10, one more small fix. Hours later, the system is unstable or completely down. What happened? Not incompetence, not carelessness. Hidden dependencies. Modern systems are tightly coupled. A small change in one place propagates in unexpected ways. Effects aren't linear, they cascade. A fix touches a library. The library affects another service. That service triggers a failure somewhere else. The original estimate was made in isolation. The failure happened in a system. And that difference matters. Systems punish underestimation faster than individuals. A homeowner plans a simple update. Open the wall, replace a fixture, clean it up. Then the wall comes down. Behind it are plumbing issues, electrical problems, structural concerns that were never visible from the outside. What looked like a cosmetic change becomes a major repair. Again, no deception, no incompetence. The problem is that buildings are designed to hide complexity. Pipes, wires, load-bearing structures, they exist precisely where you can't see them. And discovery only happens after irreversible action. Once the wall is open, there's no going back. Which leads to a key insight. Most complexity stays hidden until you commit. At large scales, the same error becomes more expensive. Consider the Scottish Parliament building. Early estimates placed the cost between 10 and 40 million pounds. The final cost was approximately 414 million pounds. There was no single villain, no sudden collapse in competence. Instead, the familiar pattern appeared, amplified by scale. Early optimism about scope and design. Commitments that locked in direction before uncertainty was resolved. Incremental expansions that each seemed reasonable on their own. By the time the full complexity was visible, the project was already too far along to reverse. This is why large projects are so instructive. They make the planning fallacy impossible to dismiss as personal weakness. The framing matters here. Large projects don't fail because people lie. They fail because early certainty hardens too soon. At this point, it's tempting to think there must be a kind of person who avoids this. There isn't. A common misconception about the planning fallacy is that it happens to careless people, people who don't plan, people who lack discipline. But the evidence points in the opposite direction. The people most vulnerable to this error are often the most capable. Expertise increases familiarity. Familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence accelerates commitment. When you've done similar work before, the task feels smaller. You recognize the steps. You've solved problems like this in the past. The early phase feels controlled. That feeling of control is not neutral. It shortens deliberation. It reduces caution. It pushes decisions forward before uncertainty is fully exposed. And once commitment happens, once time, reputation, or resources are invested, uncertainty becomes harder to acknowledge. Not because people are dishonest, but because revising the plan now feels costly. This creates a quiet trap. The more competent you are, the faster you move. The faster you move, the less time you leave for friction to surface. And the less friction you see, the more confident the plan feels. By the time reality catches up, the course is already set. Which leads to the line that matters most here. The planning fallacy doesn't punish ignorance. It punishes confidence. Once you see who this error affects, the next question isn't why it happens, it's what it quietly damages over time. The most harmful effects of the planning fallacy are not dramatic failures. They are slow, cumulative costs. Costs that don't feel connected to a single mistake, but reshape behavior, stress, and trust over time. One of the first is chronic overcommitment. Because plans feel reasonable when they're made, people say yes too often. But when multiple optimistic plans collide with reality, capacity is exceeded without anyone noticing, which leads to deadline stacking. Each commitment assumes the others will go as planned. When none of them do, pressure compounds. Deadlines don't just slip, they overlap. From there, stress becomes cyclical. Every delay creates the conditions for the next one. And eventually something more subtle breaks. Trust. Trust from others and trust in oneself. People begin to internalize what is actually a structural error. Why can't I manage my time? This is where self-blame takes root. But when people blame themselves for structural errors, they don't redesign systems. They push harder. They repeat the same mistake with more effort and less margin. Which brings us to an important boundary. Understanding the planning fallacy does not automatically fix it. Awareness does not neutralize the mechanism. What it does is create the conditions for a different approach, one that assumes error, friction, and delay before they appear. And once that cost is visible, one final insight brings everything together. The most dangerous part of planning is not getting things wrong. It's feeling finished before reality has even begun. That feeling of completion, the calm, the confidence, the relief, arrives early, before friction, before uncertainty, before the work itself. And that's why this error is so durable. The planning fallacy survives intelligence. It survives experience. It survives motivation. Because it doesn't live in the effort or skill, it lives in how the human mind imagines the future. Your journey toward practical wisdom begins with clarity, and I'm honored to walk that path with you. Together, we're building a world where wisdom is practical, accessible, and deeply human. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. And as always, think deeply. Live wisely.